Hello, hello, hello.
Hello.
Can you understand me?
Yes,
I'm a friend of your mommy's.
I know your voice. Mommy visits you. She calls you doctor.
That's right. I'm your mommy's doctor. I take care of you and your mommy. I'm happy to talk to you.
How can you hear me?
It's a special way to hear babies.
I heard Mommy say she's going for ultrasound so she can see me.
Well, this is a new kind of ultrasound, but it's much better. It allows me to talk with you while you're still inside your mommy.
Can my mommy hear me now?
No, she has to be asleep so that I can hear you better.
Sometimes I talk to my mommy, but she doesn't hear me.
Don't worry, your mommy will hear everything you say after you're born.
But I don't know if I will ever be born.
Of course you will be born. You and your mummy are perfectly healthy, and in just a few months' time you will celebrate your very own birthday.
Doctor, there's something I need to know.
Please ask me anything.
Am I a girl or a boy?
Why, you're a wonderful little boy.
Oh, does being wonderful mean that I can be born?
My dear child, what are you saying? Of course you will be born.
But I heard my mommy say she wants a girl to be born. Are you going to tell her that I'm a boy?
Well, you must understand. In the big world your mummy has rights that even I cannot deny her, so I must tell her.
Sometimes I call my daddy. I think he hears me in his dreams, but he doesn't know me. I wish he could understand me. Do you dream, Doctor?
Yes, I dream.
What about?
I can't remember. I forget my dreams when I wake up.
My dreams are my memories.
What do you dream about?
I dream about laughing. Sometimes I hear my daddy laughing. I wish he could hold me in his arms and make me laugh. And running. Do you run, Doctor?
Well, I'm too old now, but I used to run.
I dream about running. I wish I could run away from my daddy and let him catch me. We would laugh forever. I love my daddy. Only he can help me now. But he can't hear me. Can you help me to talk to him just like we're talking now?
I'm sorry, I can't bring your daddy here.
Why not?
It's difficult to explain.
Is it because of my mommy's rights?
Something like that.
I wish I had rights.
But you will have rights after you're born.
Unless I have rights now, I will never be born. Does my daddy have rights?
Oh yes, your daddy is grown up and all grown up people have rights.
Does he have the right to save me?
My dear child, you're asking me impossible questions. I'm just your doctor.
I'm so curious about the world. Sometimes I think I can taste it. Do you have a grown-up baby, Doctor?
Yes, I have 2 children.
Are they curious too?
Yes, they are. Sometimes too much.
Do you make them laugh?
Yes, I make them laugh.
Do they remember their dreams?
I don't know, really.
Doctor,
Yes,
does it hurt?
does what hurt?
Mummy calls it termination.
I don't know.
I'm afraid, Doctor.
But there's no need for you to be afraid. Everything will work out well in the end, you will see.
If only I could speak to my daddy. Can't you help me, please?
My child, I'm your mummy's doctor. You're asking something impossible from me.
After you tell Mummy about me, she will terminate me. Will we ever talk again?
Of course we will.
Doctor?
Yes?
Can you promise me one thing?
My child, I'm just a doctor.
Please, not because you're a doctor. Promise me one thing, please.
If I can.
After it's all over, will you tell my daddy I love him?
Our media entertains us with fantasies about talking to aliens and robots and animals and monsters and fairies and even ghosts, but we're forbidden to think about talking to our own unborn babies. So we live in a world where the person that discovers a way for the human brain to communicate with computers will be celebrated as a genius, and the person who discovers a way to communicate with chimpanzees will be nominated for a Nobel Prize. But the person who discovers a way to communicate with unborn babies will be condemned as a hater of women. In 2008, the Spanish Parliament adopted a resolution proposing to extend legal rights to chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans and bonobos. The director of the campaign that sponsored the proposal announced, quote, "This is a historic day in the struggle for animal rights and in defense of our evolutionary comrades, which will doubtless go down in the history of humanity." End quote. The Guardian reported that these non-human hominids are the closest genetic relatives to humans, that they have the right to life and freedom and not to be tortured, and that they display emotions such as love, fear, anxiety, and jealousy, and should be protected by similar laws. End quote. But if animals could talk, wouldn't they want to ask us, why are we so troubled by what we do to animals but not what we do to our own babies? And would the answer run something along the lines of, babies are not our evolutionary comrades? As we have learned by experience, though, the question of the right to life of the unborn always arrives back at the issue of female choice. Indeed, it doesn't matter what proof or evidence one might offer. The more incontrovertible the evidence, the more single-minded the answer. My body, my choice, and a woman's right to choose. So when it comes down to it, maybe feminists are telling it like it really is, because in evolutionary terms, it is the primacy of female choice that matters most to women. But this female prerogative to choose is not confined only to the right to life of the unborn, or indeed only to women's mating choices. It is stated most boldly when the argument concerns the life of babies, but it also guides the actions and reactions of women on many other issues. Actually, there are many species that exhibit an imbalance in the power to choose when it comes to mating, and these imbalances give rise to some outlandish effects. Just ask the peacock, or the pheasant, or the bird of paradise. So to put it another way, the primacy of female choice is about evolution, or more specifically, about sexual selection. There are therefore very good reasons why anyone being concerned about the conditions of life for men and children should pay greater attention to how women talk about their own natural right to choose. Not least because it is that female prerogative to choose and the belief held by many of those women that their choices should not have negative consequences, which makes gynocentric society such a risk-filled experience for everybody who is not woman. Now it's worth noting here a statement made by Dr. Diana Fleischman in her introductory lecture to evolutionary psychology that, quote, In the future, there will no longer be evolutionary psychology and non-evolutionary psychology. At some point, all psychology is going to be evolutionary psychology." End quote. It remains to be seen, of course, whether the field of psychology as we know it will allow itself to be subsumed. But even if it does, we cannot assume that any expert in evolutionary psychology who breaks with academic tradition by declaring that men are not as bad as they're portrayed and women are not as good as they pretend will not get cancelled. Nonetheless, by declaring that psychology is influenced by evolution, the experts are also admitting that gynocentrism is influenced by evolution, because gynocentrism is just as much about the state and conditions of the mind as is psychology. So if one is influenced by evolution, it would be unreasonable to say that the other is not. Although evolution is a process that takes place over long periods of time, the most noteworthy recent event relating to evolution has been population explosion. The human population of the world has tripled since 1950, from 2.5 billion people to 7.7 billion people, which means that the environmental pressures keeping human population growth in check have been mitigated, especially over this recent period. But this change in environmental pressure also creates a disturbance in the influence of sexual selection. In other species like the peacock, for instance, the absence of effective predators and the easy availability of food leaves little else to do except fuss over mating choices, knowing that there will not be any consequences, at least not for the females. So female choice is not necessarily about doing what is best for the children or for the social group at large, but can also, when left to its own devices, be whimsical, self-indulgent, and even absurd. If human females balanced their choices fairly with the interests of their evolutionary comrades, it is very likely that nobody would be found to object to them, but they are not balanced fairly. So men are starting to recognize that the domination of female choice has mutated from a barely tolerable form of gynocentrism to an intolerable and pugnacious tyranny. Furthermore, in their eagerness to be seen to support women, the institutions of our state, our media, our economy, and education system have abandoned any duty of care for men. This abandonment has added fuel to a more widespread loss of trust, which is a bigger problem than it might appear, because trust is the foundation for consent. So when trust is eroded, so is consent, which means that democracy, otherwise known as government by consent of the people, is facing an existential crisis. Thus we have arrived at a point where our societal inability to resist female choice is hurting democracy at a time when democracy needs friends. Even if we were to leave feminists out of the picture, civil society would still have a problem with the prime directive of female sexual selection, meaning a woman's prerogative to choose. In this respect, we could even view historical patriarchy not as a problem, but as a solution not designed to oppress women, but to protect everybody else from women and to protect women from themselves. Females in gynocentric societies have shown that they will stick together in ways that are unjust, illogical, and even dishonest, for no other reason than to reinforce the hegemony of female choice, which causes the system of justice and public administration to be skewed, thus further increasing the loss of trust and making our judges sound like women who say, "Where have all the good men gone?" Now, if these sound like things that we should be concerned to limit in some way, then we need to recall some reasons why female choice exerts so exaggerated a power in our society. And the first thing we need to talk about is reproduction. The role that women play in reproduction has always earned them special indulgence and protection. But women have increasingly exchanged the role of reproduction for the role of labourer in the economy. On the face of it, that should mean that women might be surrendering some part of their inherited protections. But the reality is that their increased participation in the workforce played a key part in keeping real wages down since the 1960s. This was a big win for the elite class, whose wealth grew exponentially in the same period. As for the children that are needed for the future, those children that women are not having, that deficiency was easy to make up with immigration. The real outcome is therefore that rather than losing some of the influence and protections that they already enjoyed, women have actually gained power, and it is a power to which the elite class of modern society is very sensitive because it directly affects their own status and wealth. This same sensitivity does not extend toward the male labour force because it is taken for granted that males have no other choice than to work. The sensitivity of the elite class to the choices of women is further magnified by their role as consumers, a role to which they rose by some orders of magnitude greater than men, giving them a podium status in the eyes of the capital elite. As if this wasn't enough already, now we have to talk about sex. The feminist narrative about sex is stated explicitly by Kathleen Voss and Roy Baumeister, who wrote a paper about something they call sexual economics. In this paper they say that their, quote, analysis offers an explanation for men's pursuit of power over women while allowing the possibility that what men want from women is mainly sex, end quote. The title of this paper in full is Sexual Economics, Sex as Female Resource for Social Exchange in Heterosexual Interactions. Of course, it's not what the authors intended, but when we add their explanation to their title, we get a justification for OnlyFans, or indeed, hypergamous marriage, or anything that women wish to do or not do relating to sex. As a narrative, though, the power and sex argument is incomplete when left to stand on its own, because it is also tied to a sister narrative about male violence. Wikipedia describes the Duluth model, for instance, as the feminist theory that men use violence within relationships to exercise power and control. When we therefore place Pence, the author of Duluth, and Voss together, we get a more complete narrative, which is that men use violence to get power over women, and men want power over women to get sex. This larger narrative about sex, violence and power is, to borrow a phrase, a social construct, one that is now baked into our culture and social and even education system, meaning that any loss or harm that men suffer, even harm that has nothing to do with their conduct towards women, is treated with indifference or even becomes a reason to celebrate. Looking at it from another angle, this narrative also enlists the power of the state to enforce female word and female choice, so that female choice has now moved from being a behaviour of individual women to a powerful undercurrent that shapes the policies and laws of the state. Knowing this, men are well entitled to take a less apologetic view of sex. For instance, Voss and Baumeister go on to describe a sexual marketplace in which the demand side of the transaction comes from men. In other words, they acknowledge that men have a stronger sex drive than women. This aspect of male sexuality is most often portrayed as a moral problem with men, when in actual fact it is an evolved characteristic of male physiology, and it is a characteristic that was shaped by female sexual selection, a selection process that was in turn influenced by the rewards offered for the transaction. So maybe that's why they call it the oldest profession, because as far as we know, throughout history, women were having more sex more often with those males who offered better rewards, meaning that males with a stronger sex drive tended to have more children. So their male children then inherited a stronger than average sex drive, and they in their turn followed the same mating impulse, which means that the stronger male need for sex may have urged men to greater achievements, but it also became an Achilles heel that has incrementally allowed females to exercise ever greater power over them, making it just another win for the females of our species. This vulnerability has now been magnified by the consumer society, which has for its own purposes showered women with encouragements to flaunt their sexuality, thereby creating a dynamic where men are on the one hand bombarded with titillating imagery and on the other hand shamed for showing any interest in that titillation. When we therefore add up the equations of female power, we find there has been a tsunami of an evolutionary kind. The burgeoning power of women to exercise their own freedom to choose without regard for the interests either of their most fragile dependents or their most enduring supporters calls into question our most fundamental assumptions. And the abandon with which women have exercised that power has done more than anything else ever could to awaken men to the price they pay for being men. Probably the most startling aspect of this is the fact that so many people seem to think that it is a new problem, something that must have emerged from the chaos of modern consumer society or the gorging of those consumers on the toxic narratives of feminism. But this is not a new problem. In fact, the story of the Garden of Eden, as it is told in the book of Genesis, tells us as much about the modern relationship between men and women as any magazine article produced by fawning experts. After all, there's no evidence of patriarchy in the Garden of Eden. Indeed, it is hardly by coincidence that the snake approaches Eve rather than Adam. And by so doing, this story forewarns us of a very contemporary phenomenon, meaning the female susceptibility to suggestion. This is a phenomenon that modern advertisers absolutely depend on, and their prioritization of female consumers is demonstrable proof of their secretive calculations. Furthermore, the susceptibility to suggestion is listed as a symptom of hysteria, which is mostly a female pathology. This pathology also includes attention-seeking behavior, which explains why low-level hysteria incubates perfect consumers, and why the condition therefore receives so little exposure. The allegory of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Creation is also a story of rebellion. Not a rebellion by Eve against Adam, but rather by Eve against God. A declaration by Eve that, I am here now, so this is not your garden, it's my garden, making it less a Garden of Eden and more a Garden of Eve. And just as revealing is the way in which Eve makes her challenge, not by openly stating a rational case or an honest wish to the creator of the garden, but rather by disobedience and defiance. Equally ominous, given what we now know about the tendencies of men, is the fact that Adam did not need the promptings of the snake to concede to Eve, thereby suggesting that our ancestors were already familiar with the moral jeopardy posed by the saying, if Mama's happy, everybody's happy. Another important part of this story is how God created woman from the rib of Adam, which, when taken at face value, is an idea that appears to satisfy creationists and feed ideas about patriarchy. But just like other parts of the story, this part is also not only designed to impress creationists, because it is in fact a very succinct contradiction of female instincts. Far from being anti-science, therefore, the story of Adam's rib may be based on an observation that women believe that they alone create life, and that they therefore hold special rights over that life and everything it produces, including the right to dispose of it. To put it in other words, it appears our ancestors might have thought that women needed a lesson in respect and gratitude, suggesting therefore that the sense of superiority and entitlement that characterizes the language and behavior of modern women is not of itself modern. So the author of the story of the Garden of Eden passed on to succeeding generations a certain warning, a warning that Eve sees herself as entitled to defy all authority and possess every garden. And what is true of the garden, we can assume to be also true of the home. In evolutionary terms, this means that the project we call humanity may be driven just as much by the principle of the selfish vagina as it is by the selfish gene, which is important because under the rules of that paradigm, men become disposable and children little more than collateral beneficiaries. Of course, it sounds like a very abstract exercise to talk about female sexual selection, and no doubt a chorus of voices will claim that even if it is real, it doesn't have meaningful effect. Like those people who talk about the advertising industry knowing that the annual advertising budgets of corporations runs into billions of dollars, but then claim that they personally are intelligent and independent, so it has no influence on them. So let's review some of the real and moral implications arising from the primacy of female choice, and also try to answer the inevitable question, how can we resist the irresistible power wielded by Eve? For starters, the prerogative to choose translates in the personality as entitlement. Also, people who prioritize their own choices over the choices of others are inclined to want control over their relationships, and in order to reserve for themselves the widest range of choices, they strive to increase the attention they receive. Furthermore, although choice can be whimsical, it is not completely arbitrary. It seeks benefits, so it will lean in directions from where it can obtain better rewards, meaning overall that people who are motivated even subliminally by a selfish prerogative to choose will be inclined towards entitled, controlling, attention-seeking, and hypergamous behaviors. But the benefits obtained from those behaviors also demand justification if they are to be sustained in the long term, therefore requiring narratives which exaggerate both the virtues of the recipient and the guilt and indebtedness of the donor, which suggests its own explanation for the unjustified enmity that women appear to harbour for men. Looking at it in the context of the consumer economy, choosing is spending, and most consumer spending is female spending. So when we talk about consumer choice and consumer spending, we are talking about an exaggerated desire in women, a desire that has evolved rather than been adopted, a desire that resists being satisfied because it is the act of choosing that excites the evolved instinct, which explains why the consumer economy adores women. Looking beyond the economy towards the politics, evolutionary psychologists assert that our behavior is influenced by evolution, so it would be illogical to think that our political inclinations are immune from that influence. The problem with this being that the female prerogative to choose is not democratic. It does not recognize any other right to choose. In fact, this highly evolved female prerogative must logically be inclined more towards authoritarianism than democracy, and having enjoyed the power that it does for as long as it has, it must also attract bad actors seeking to profit from association with that power. The collective effect of these forces is dragging civil society towards a crisis of trust. Actually, we are already deep into that crisis. In environmental language, we would call this unsustainable. The casualties are mounting up and the structures are breaking down, leading ironically to ever greater demands for control and ever greater efforts to stifle dissent. This crisis of trust has gone beyond the pressing issues affecting the rights and lives of men and babies, because all of the institutions on which we depend for justice, security, prosperity, and progress are destabilized by it. Perhaps more troubling still, this decline in trust creates the conditions in which fear can be propagated, a fear that is the calling card of bad actors and the mobs that follow them. We can build the best society possible, but we cannot legislate for trust, and the reason for that is because trust is built on moral conduct. There were some philosophers who dwelt on the subject before him, but it is Plato who is credited with some of the most important contributions to moral reasoning, among those being that the moral condition of the state is not separate from the moral condition of its people. If you want one, you have to achieve the other. So if you want a just and trustworthy society, you have to have people who value truth. Plato also demonstrated how moral principles do not need to depend on religion or faith in a god to prove their value. Rather, they need to be justified on their own merits if they're to be followed by people of any faith or no faith. So if there's anyone who ever deserved the title Doctor of Philosophy, it would be Plato, because even though he lived almost 2,500 years ago, he diagnosed a problem that we think is unique to our time. Plato and those who came after him also established an order of priority among the virtues. This idea gained such credit that it was eventually adopted by the Catholic Church. They were known as the cardinal virtues, cardinal in this sense meaning paramount, those virtues without which the other virtues become ineffectual. Now I have to bring in a disclaimer here. I declare under pain of heavenly cancellation that I am not sponsored by Jesus, nor by any of his subsidiaries or competitors, So please consider the merits and relevance of these virtues to our present circumstances at face value. Of course, different traditions each have their own approach to morality which should be acknowledged, but it is the tradition within which feminism has metastasized whose moral values we are discussing here. There's also a saying that you can know something about a man by knowing his enemies, but what is true of the man is also true of his virtues, meaning that there is something to be learned about the virtues by knowing who despises them and why. So I will also give some credit to supporting actors for teaching us about the hidden strength of virtue. That said, the first of the cardinal virtues is prudence, which sounds inane and out of date, like a virgin debutante in a Jane Austen novel. But prudence is about good judgment, careful judgment, judgment that requires maturity and wisdom, judgment that recognizes how actions have consequences for oneself and for others, consequences that sometimes take years to materialize. So prudent judgment is the manifest behavior of empathy and wisdom, which means that prudence creates trust. The second cardinal virtue is justice, not the illusion of justice used by the sly elite to foment anger, but the sense of justice that guides a fair-minded conscience, thus causing people to place high value on truth and enabling them to feel free and happy. Whereas prudence includes intuition, justice includes reason, open-mindedness, and a commitment to truth. But these attitudes cannot be compartmentalized, so the qualities of character that strive for justice among people also naturally strive to reveal the sciences and inspire discovery. The third cardinal virtue is fortitude, meaning courage in the face of fear. This seemed to make more sense in the past because fear used to come in big packages like disease, famine, poverty, and conflict. However, fear, anger, and guilt have also, perhaps always, been used to manipulate people, and the irony is that we suffer much less now from calamities and much more from manipulation. So the fortitude that we need today is the courage to resist manipulation, not only to resist manipulation by fear, but also by anger and guilt. The fourth cardinal virtue is temperance, meaning moderation. Given its past association with prohibition, temperance could arguably be the least fashionable of all the classical virtues. But this is a great loss to us all, because temperance has a new enemy in the consumer society, a society that encourages indulgence and consumption at every possible advertising moment. Indeed, the early architects of the consumer society promoted the idea of creating desires in the population and then satisfying those desires with consumer goods. They proposed this not just for the purpose of making money, but also as a way to pacify the dangerous masses. Obviously, the power brokers of the time could have chosen to encourage temperance, but that option would have been less profitable and perhaps also less reliable. So the virtue of temperance became inconvenient for political reasons just as much as for economic reasons. But the consumer society is not the only player with skin in the game. Dr. Danielle Zandbergen, for instance, explains the results of research that she carried out on disparities between the health of men and women thus, quote, "Women prefer men who take slight risks with their health by ignoring minor illnesses and fatigue, which is consistent with most findings on women's preferences for risky behavior." End quote. Obviously, Zandbergen meant risky behavior in men, and not just risky behavior in how men manage their health. And it also seems like stating the obvious to say that risky behavior increases in the absence of temperance, which means that from the viewpoint of both our evolutionary superiors and our capital elite, any display of temperance by men could be treated as a sign of rebellion or perhaps labelled as hate speech. Leaving aside the cardinal virtues, the philosopher Cicero is remembered among other things for having said, quote, "Gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues but the parent of all the others." End quote. Cicero had his own reasoning for that. But even now we can observe that gratitude encourages children to appreciate the endeavours and sacrifices of their parents, thus helping the child to mature and strengthening the family in the process. The problem with this being that modern social and feminist thinkers do not want strong families any more than they do mature people, because the former is an obstacle to their ambition, and the latter makes people resist devious suggestion. If Cicero were alive now, he might shrug and roll his eyes, because scientists have discovered that gratitude and generosity are two sides of the same coin. And therein lies another problem, because our social thinkers want generosity to be a function of the state rather than a virtue of the individual. And besides, they don't want ordinary people to adopt a kind or generous interpretation of their own history or their own ancestors, leading them therefore to hate their own ancestry and feel grateful to the state, which makes control over generosity the ultimate political power play. Not that gratitude is any more welcome in their eyes, because gratitude discourages accusing behavior. Part calculating method and part behavioral disorder, accusing behavior is the postmodern contagion, a contagion that thrives by creating guilt, a guilt which weakens the resolve and promotes a feeling of indebtedness in those who are accused. Overall, then, we could say that the classical virtues have not lost their relevance, perhaps even the opposite, because these virtues also require one to think independently for oneself, which is not a habit that our superiors like to encourage. So when we now return to the evolutionary imbalance in the right to choose, we can see it in a moral context, because contrary to the impressions created by all that virtue signalling, the female prerogative to choose is an amoral primal drive that has entrenched itself in our political and economic system and been reinforced by entities that have discovered how to harness it, which places this female instinct directly at odds with our desire to create a moral and civil society. We can also see that the rights of men are inextricably joined with the right to life of the unborn, because those who have the power to choose have made the choice to dehumanize both, and it is this callous dehumanization which both have to overcome, a feat which one cannot achieve without the other. So there's a compelling case for people who support the right to life of the unborn and people who support the rights of men to acknowledge their common interest and recognize the power that kills them both. This power hides in plain sight, obscured by behaviors that create distraction and confusion, while at the same time making the world appear crystal clear to an army of white knights. Feminists purport to hate bad men who do harm to women, but the truth is that they need those men to create fear in timid women and guilt in timid men. So their real hatred is reserved for the moral man, because they know better than most that the moral man resists manipulation with the same strength that he resists temptation. When we therefore ask ourselves what remedies there are, how can we resist the irresistible? How can we save babies? How can we save men and women for that matter? How can we counter slander? How can we salvage the trust on which all community depends? Our answers must be tempered by the knowledge that men live in a hostile environment, so their every word and action is subject to abrasive scrutiny, which makes the toxic dictum of man up just another lash in the whip that beats them. Nonetheless, at least according to our ancient wise ones, the remedies must include the vigour of the moral man, the man who discovers his own virtues in spite of his enemies, those virtues which, being a man's best friend, will always defend him and always make him free. Having said that, it is also necessary to say that being moral is not on its own an adequate defense against snakes, and the thing to note about the snake in the Garden of Eden is that it spread its poison using words. In conclusion, thanks to Mike Buchanan and the team at J4MB for making this video possible, and thanks to you for listening. Bye now.